Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1154 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. Well, I can tell you one thing, guys. I was not prepared for that. You know what I'm talking about. I've got questions. I'm sure that you have questions. Let's just jump into the review. So we begin this chapter with a bit of clarification around the timeline. This is obviously Harold and Loki, I guess, hired into some extent's backstory, but we begin with Big Mom's flashback. The day of her first rage when she killed Elder Yorl. Actually, in that flashback, it was mentioned that Loki had just been born. So this just feels like some timeline clarification, although you guys should already know I want probably more than anyone for the Big Mom pirates and Big Mom to be relevant in some way to this arc. But as chapters tick by, this seems less and less likely. But yeah, we're essentially told, starting with Big Mom, that Elbaf was faced with a series of tragedies, and Loki was ultimately blamed for these tragedies. The narrator says it was calamity after calamity, sudden fires, windstorms, and bitter cold waves devastated the crops. The abnormal weather also brought fishing to a halt. This once magnificent land had fallen into famine. But there is an interesting question in all of this. Like, I think logically we just assume that these are coincidences. I think that we intuitively know that Loki's birth has nothing to do with them. But even believing this, I'm still left wondering, are these really coincidences? We already know that the world government had an interest in Elbaf at this time because of Mother Carmel, who was a Cypherpole agent. As it seems to me, she was stationed in Elbaf, and her job essentially was to steal children from the country, kind of similar to what is happening right now. Although what is happening right now is far more overt. She leaves, and then suddenly there's a whole bunch of crazy disasters. I don't know if that's a coincidence. We already know that weather manipulation technology exists. We just had Egghead. At which stage in development was this technology at this time? We don't precisely know, but it's conceivable. The only other thing to question is what would be the world government's motive? I certainly don't have the answer, and I definitely don't want to spend minutes trying to construct some kind of fictitious narrative, but it seems possible to me. As Littlefinger says in Game of Thrones, chaos is a ladder, provides opportunity. As weird as it might be to say, I kind of wonder if the world government preferred the Giants when they were raiding, because they have been doing that for hundreds of years, relatively unopposed. And even in the present story, the God's Knights have indicated that they weren't all that happy with what Elbaf has become, due to Harold's efforts. Essentially, the first thing that they did when they got here was demanded that the Giants destroy their library. We still don't 100% understand how Emu's powers work, so we are still speculating several weeks later, but like a thought that could work a lot in retrospect is, hey, the more evil the king, the more influenced they can be by Emu's powers. It's easier to flip them. So you can think about it like the world government exploited King Harold's Elbaf with Mother Carmel, because you realize King Harold ruled over Elbaf for the last 30 to 40 years, right? During that window, Mother Carmel found a way to gain sanctuary in the country to execute the world government's schemes of stealing children. Before Harold, something like this may not have been possible at all because of how the Giants viewed humans. But it certainly took a lot of effort from Mother Carmel herself in order to accomplish this, and by the time that she's banished along with Big Mom, then the world government really might prefer it go back to how it was. But here we are, I guess, spending a few minutes constructing a fictitious narrative. But it's just kind of where my mind goes. Elbaf is hit with extreme famine, and the immediate response to this for the Giants themselves from the country is, hey, let's go raid the humans. Hey, let's attack each other. It destabilizes Harold's rule and everything that he stood for. So with a theory like this in mind, you can almost read the chapter in an entirely different way. A little later in the chapter, Harold and Jarl directly talk about how his efforts, despite his effort, aren't seeming to work out quite like he had envisioned. As if he has some kind of enemy that he is unaware of. It is highly implied based on this dialogue that this enemy is the world government. Jarl says directly there's probably a deeper reason why your ideals haven't worked out, and it has nothing to do with you. So it makes you think about the moment where Harold arrived back to the country to deal with the famine with the help of all of the allies that he had painstakingly gathered over the course of his life how big of a coup that was. There was a secret battle that even Harold was unaware of between him and the world government. They had been secretly acting to oppose him, and he foiled them without even realizing it. So I suppose for now, this is how I'm choosing to interpret what happened. It feels like what the chapter has implied, if not directly about the cause of Elbaf's famine. That just makes what the world government was doing even more intricate, and in my opinion, interesting. Also, I suppose while we're here, the economics of all of this is so interesting to me. I can't say that I know everything on this topic, but it just seems to me to be very likely that Oda was inspired by actual Vikings. So I'm sure everybody is aware of this, but in case you're not, right, the place in the world that is associated with Vikings the most is Northern Europe, Scandinavia. If you want to pull up a map, this is like Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And it just so happens that these places are pretty cold. It's always been a mind bender for me that Spain is on the same latitude as New York, or roughly the same. I'm not going to look it up, which is crazy because Spain is an incredibly warm place to live, and New York, not so much. As a fun fact, this relates to ocean currents, which tangentially relates to One Piece, so I'm going to say it. But if you pull up a map and you look at Finland, Sweden, and Norway, they're about on the same latitude as Greenland, which is almost literally a glacier, straight up. Anyway, I'm not entirely sure why I said all of this. Maybe it was interesting to somebody out there. But as Elbaf has this like great winter, right? It feels like some of the conditions that actual Vikings would have dealt with. Relatively normal. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that in this flashback and in this chapter, Oda is really utilizing Viking culture. I think that harsh winters likely influence Viking raiding culture significantly, although kind of indirectly. It's just a place with a challenging climate, cold, long winters, short growing seasons, limited arable land. All of this creates resource scarcity, i.e. famine, especially in a place like Norway, where the fjords and mountains restrict farming, which is another way that you can correlate actual Viking places of origin with Elbaf. The underworld seems, for the most part, totally underutilized because it is very difficult to do anything with that land, and it is cold and mountainous. So whether the world government is responsible for Elbaf's crazy weather or not, you can kind of see how Elbaf being a land of pirates maybe makes some sense. In times of great scarcity, perhaps the best option these people had available to them was to go south and take from other people who were weaker than them. But I don't want to paint these people as entirely raid-centric because they weren't. Vikings were also responsible for the development of significant trade routes. Again, this is actual world history. Viking trade routes were extensive, connecting Scandinavia with Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia, roughly 1000 AD. So in terms of the world at the time, Vikings connected through trade the entire world. The whole reason why the Vikings were so good at this is because of their advanced shipbuilding and navigation skills. We'll come back to this eventually. But I think that a lot of people have the impression that ships were useful in going over very large bodies of water, crossing entire oceans and seas, which of course the Vikings could do, and a thing that was not taught to me in school as a child, but the Vikings were most likely the first ones to have discovered North America from Europe. It maybe should be Leif Erikson Day and not Columbus Day. But yeah, boats are also incredibly useful for traversing rivers, which is relevant to understand how Vikings became masters of trade. An attack by river was also a thing. But the whole reason that these routes were established is because Scandinavians or the Vikings needed access to resources that were scarce where they were from, due to their harsh climate, while at the same time capitalizing on the things that they did have, that other parts of the world did not. But yeah, when it comes to the Viking legacy, I think that for most people, trade is not a part of that, but it was absolutely a part of it. Vikings greatly contributed to the interconnectedness of the world at the time. Of course, you know that the Vikings traded with the English, the Scottish, the Irish, right? The French. That makes a lot of sense. But they also traded with Russians, all the way down to Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, and even places like Baghdad. So to me, it really feels as though Oda's gone out of his way to make sure that the culture of Elbaf and the country of Elbaf is very reminiscent to actual Vikings from actual history. He's kind of captured this contradiction that on one hand, these are fearsome warriors that will raid and pillage anybody and everybody, and at the same time, they foster diplomacy and trade with anybody and everybody. But like I said earlier, the reason why the Vikings played such a pivotal role is really their mastery of shipbuilding. Like literally, they just made ships that were better than everybody else, likely in response to how difficult it is to sail the Arctic and the Baltic Sea. You can watch some videos online if you want to, but there's certain parts of the Arctic that are really tricky to navigate, not to mention the ice. The Mediterranean, in contrast, is a cakewalk. That's paradise. The Vikings could literally build ships to reach the New World. I don't know if this is true, but it sounds good, like the greatest sailors on the planet at the time. Again, another fun fact I'm sure that most people are not going to care about, right? But in the Baltic Sea, obviously you have to worry about icebergs and glaciers and random islands creating crazy currents, but you also had a lot of reefs. So one of the most important aspects of a Viking longship was that it was lightweight, so it wouldn't sink too far into the ocean, which allowed it to navigate very shallow waters, which became very relevant when trying to sail in rivers. Anyway, I bring all this up because to me, it is not a coincidence that Oda has finally decided to focus on Elbaf giants and shipbuilding. If you were a culture based on real-world Vikings, this almost has to be a part of it. I was kind of expecting it, and I didn't end up saying it last week, but when it was implied that the giants didn't have great builders, it didn't seem quite right to me. Lo and behold, it appears that Oda had a plan. But anyway, I want to talk this through with you guys. So this is what we got from the chapter. Heralds attended secretly the revelry, and that put him in danger. We may come back to this later. But Elder Jarl says, if you were caught, all of this would be the least of your worries. Haven't you heard the tale of the Gale Ra Warhammer Company? And it's apparently intentional that the Gale Ra sounds a lot like the Gale Law, the shipbuilding group founded by Tom in Water 7. But because I struggle to pronounce these words in an audibly different way, I'm just going to call them the Warhammer Company, but realize it's also pretty much Gale Law. Harold says, they're that gruff troop of giant shipwrights that arm themselves with warhammers, right? I thought that they were just a myth. And Elder Jarl says, no, they existed. They really did travel far and wide, sending letters back to Elbaf. I received the final letter myself. It said they'd all been captured. Can you believe it? Over 100 warriors were taken prisoner, including ancient giants. So just a timeline for this, that makes sense to me. Elder Jarl is something like 350 years old. He says that he received, personally, the final letter from this company. So, I mean, this could have been something like 250 years ago. For me, that is long ago enough for a character like King Harold to consider this group to have been a myth. So let's say it was 250 years ago. At that time, the giants were actually, most likely, the premier shipbuilders in the entire world. We don't actually get any specifics as to why this company did what they did, but for some reason, they collectively, as a whole, left Elbaf to travel the world. To me, it seems likely that they were seeking business. And there could even be a story within this very similar to King Harold's own story. The leader of the company found that they liked humans and wanted to interact with them. So I'm not sure where else this fits in, so I'm going to go ahead and say it now. When you think of the name Gale Law or Gale Ra, I think the law part of this almost definitely relates to singing. A galley is a kind of ship, and law because they were a singing band of shipbuilders. I'm just telling you that the history of this company is almost definitely very related, or has at least a part to play in the Void Century. This kind of thing makes me think about Binks Sake and the romanticized culture of piracy in the world of One Piece. Like another thing that we know, although we don't know any of the details, is Joy Boy is supposedly the first ever pirate. Or at least he was the first pirate for a very long time. But pirates need ships. You guys know that there's parallels constantly in the story of One Piece. We talk about it all the time, right? But Goldie Roger's ship, the Oro Jackson, was made by Tom, who founded the Galley Law Company in Water 7. The Straw Hat Pirates have their ship, the Sunny, also essentially made by Galley Law, Iceberg, and Frankie. It is therefore pretty likely to me that Joy Boy's ship was also made by the Galley Law Company, or this version from Elbaf. And this is where the connections start to deepen. The Galley Law Company are expert shipbuilders, obviously, and I'm sure that they have all sorts of intricate techniques that allow for expert navigation of the crazy oceans in the world of One Piece. However, I would say the single thing which separates Galley Law ships from other people's ships is the materials that they use. The Oro Jackson, Roger's ship, was made using Adam's wood. The Thousand Sunny, again made by Galley Law, is built utilizing Adam's wood. Guys, the Adam tree is in Elbaf. It is incredibly obvious that Tom and all of his protege thereafter were heavily influenced by the giant Warhammer Company. Hypothetically, this connection could go all the way back to the Void Century. Tom and the Fishmen learned shipbuilding techniques from the Warhammer Company all the way back in the Void Century. But I don't actually think you even need to go back that far, because we know that the Warhammer Company set out to the sea to adventure and travel to all the lands of the world, at least before they disappeared. So I could imagine a situation approximately 250 years ago. The Warhammer Company showed up in Fishman Island, and that is essentially what created Tom's version of Galley Law, where his ancestors obtained knowledge of shipbuilding. It could also be around this time that Tom's family obtained the blueprints to the ancient weapon Pluton. Because look guys, this is just something that is incredibly intuitive. It is likely that all the great seafaring constructions of the world were created by the Warhammer Company, or their ancestors. One of those theories that I just wish that I had made, and would have been pretty easy to make, but I never did, is look at the Noah, right? The Noah is this gigantic ship. It was always kind of a stretch that the fishmen were responsible for building it. It's just a ship that, if you think a lot about it, makes a lot of sense for giants to have built. And this is something that the story of One Piece and Oda have already alluded to like 13 years ago. At the conclusion of Fishman Island, you remember, Luffy partially destroyed the Noah, and as the Sea Kings are taking the ship to go get it repaired, they comment, and it's literally in the panel, that, well, the ship needs to be fixed. Can it be fixed? Well, we don't have the skills of that clan anymore. They're talking about the Warhammer Company from Elbaf. Clearly, they built the Noah. We also know that the Pluton is supposedly a ship. It is very likely they built the Pluton as well. So then you can go back to some of the comments surrounding the Pluton. We were told by Tom, I believe, that the founders passed down these blueprints because they were afraid of what they created. Now we have kind of a face to an idea. The Warhammer Company created Pluton and almost immediately regretted it. Therefore, they created the counter Pluton, or the blueprints that Frankie possessed in the present story, that was supposed to be able to stop it if it fell into the wrong hands. But yeah, I feel like what I'm saying is mostly true, but maybe you don't exactly understand why it's important to bring up. And for me, it's about Tom coming to possess these blueprints. In my opinion, this gives us potential insight into the story of the Warhammer Company. If the original builders of the Pluton were giants from Elbaf, you would expect that these blueprints would have been passed down within Elbaf. At the very least, that is likely to be the case for hundreds of years. So there's several directions that this could go, but I just have a feeling that the Warhammer Company started to adopt non-giants into their fleet before they were captured. Like, one of their members was Tom's ancestor. He became part of the crew. Or any other way that you could potentially think of that the fishmen and the giants would develop a very substantial relationship, a relationship enough to be able to share this kind of secret. It also makes me wonder if the Warhammer Company kind of knew how much danger they were in, and therefore how much danger the blueprints to the counter Pluton were in. To me, it feels like this story has the potential to reflect a lot of the events that happened in Water 7. Tom's family possessing the blueprints for the longest time kept those blueprints safe. But eventually, the world government figured out roughly where they were. They had some kind of suspicion. So Frankie was given the blueprints, changed his name, and faked his death. Basically, the Warhammer pirates were targeted by the world government because the world government had some kind of suspicion that they possessed some blueprints to Pluton, necessitating these blueprints being passed down somewhere safer. which I just think is a cool story because it makes Water 7 all the more important. Like, that was a story that we got that's a continuation of literally hundreds of years of history. And not only from the Void Century, but at certain points in time in between. But yeah, just to cross my T's and dot my I's here, not that it's really needed, but when Frankie shows us the blueprints to the counter Pluton, they're human-sized paper, right? So you just kind of have to assume here that the blueprints were retranscribed from giant-sized paper to human-sized paper. But anyway, the Warhammer Company's final letter to Elbaf said that they had been captured, and Harold's like, "You think the world government was responsible?" And Jarl says there is no doubt that they once faced a great enemy. However, they sank deep into the ocean at a certain point in history. I absolutely loathe the way that this was translated. I think that this is super confusing, and I'm hoping that the official translation words this in a way which makes it clear who Elder Jarl is talking about. Like, he could be talking about the world government here, right? The world government once had an enemy, but that enemy sank beneath the waves. That actually makes sense. However, he could also be talking from the perspective of the Warhammer Company. The Warhammer Company once had an enemy, but knowledge of this has been lost. I hate how impossible this is to read without any certainty because I feel like Jarl was trying to be pretty specific. But obviously, he's talking about something related to what Clover told us in O'Hara about the Ancient Kingdom. If he is saying that the Warhammer Company once had an enemy but that has been lost to history, he is effectively saying that the Warhammer Company was part of the Ancient Kingdom. Which would fit really well with Harold's comment, "Do you think the world government was responsible?" Because we know that Clover came to the conclusion that the 20 kings were the enemy to this mysterious lost kingdom, the Ancient Kingdom, and after the kingdom fell, the world government spawned. I feel like I'm explaining this poorly. Let's back up a moment. We know that the Ancient Kingdom was incredibly advanced. Their technology surpasses Egghead right now. We also know that there is crazy technology involved with the creation of something like the Pluton. So to me, it is very possible that the nugget that Oda is alluding to here is the Warhammer Company was a part of the Ancient Kingdom. And I don't want to confuse you guys too much, but I think that a lot of people have the impression that the Giants of Elbaf had some kind of relationship with a guy like Joy Boy. We already speculated that the Galley-Law Warhammer Company made Joy Boy's ship. We now know that Joy Boy was born from within the Ancient Kingdom, but it's also kind of implied that we should think of the Ancient Kingdom similar to the world government today. So I do not think that Joy Boy was affiliated with the Ancient Kingdom. It was simply the world-dominating force at the time. But the purpose of all this speculation is to begin to illuminate some of the mysterious aspects of the Void Century. It could work out to be very similar to the story of Tom and Goldie Roger. Tom founded a company on an island that was associated with the world government, but made a ship for an outlaw pirate. The kind of logical theory that you could make here is that the Warhammer Company was ordered by the Ancient Kingdom to build the Pluton, which they didn't really want to do, and they didn't really think was safe. Secretly, they made blueprints to one day be able to counter their creation. Could probably also think of the Warhammer Company in a similar way as Dr. Vegapunk in Egghead. You know that Vegapunk was a slave to the world government, made many things because he was ordered to, but at the same time, he has an agenda of his own and built in some safeguards that the world government was not aware of, such as the pacifista becoming loyal to Jewelry Bonnie. But again, if you want to parallel the Void Century with Tom and Roger, the sequence of events that is the most intuitive is essentially the Warhammer Company had some sort of Vegapunk-like role with the Ancient Kingdom, were affiliated with them, but they had some reservations about what they were doing. They ended up meeting and then befriending Joy Boy, and they made Joy Boy an ultimate ship that would allow Joy Boy to sail in any ocean. Because of this, they were condemned by the world government of their day, the Ancient Kingdom. It could even work out to be a one-for-one exactly the same as Tom, because we know that Tom was arrested for building Goldie Roger's ship, but they didn't execute him immediately because he made a deal with them. He promised to build the Puffing Tom first, which had the potential to grant him clemency for his crimes. So the Giants ended up making a ship for Joy Boy, which made them a criminal, and in order to gain clemency, were tasked with the creation of Pluton. Just the sort of thing that would make sense to me. It doesn't have to be precisely like this, but I feel like we're coloring in the empty spaces. But regardless of all this, I think that it's pretty rock solid that the Warhammer company built the Pluton. And we know that the world government today, their central concern, probably dating back all the way to the Void Century, is the ancient weapons, Pluton being one of them. So the giant shipbuilders go missing, and Harold's immediate question is, do you think the world government was responsible? And Jarl says there is no doubt that they once faced a great enemy. It would make sense for this enemy to be the world government. After or at the same time that the ancient kingdom was defeated by the 20 kings, the Warhammer company became a part of this conflict and were targeted by what became the world government because they built the Pluton. Although if you were listening really closely based on how we decided to flesh out this story, it would also make some sense for this great enemy to have been the ancient kingdom itself, even though the Warhammer company might have at one point in time been a part of them. In kind of the same way as Vegapung's great enemy right now is officially the world government. But anyway, the conversation continues. As I said earlier, Jarl says there's probably a deeper reason why your ideals haven't worked out, and it has nothing to do with you, meaning that there are some forces working against Harold's agenda. Harold says, lingering animosity, huh? And Jarl says, these are just rumors, but I also heard a story about a frozen army of giants somewhere. It seems our people are regarded as enemies of the larger world. So I feel like we've been talking about this for a pretty long time now, but I hope at this point you understand the purpose of all the detail, because I do think that my headcanon for how all this works makes this conversation more understandable. It's actually fascinating that Jarl and Harold are under the impression that it's the giants pillaging and raiding their history of war, which has made them enemies to the world. I don't think that they're factoring in the Pluton. It could actually be the case, or partially the case, that the giants of Elbaf adopted this pirate-centric culture in part out of necessity because they were prior labeled criminals by the world government from the jump. That was the only way that they could survive. They were forced to self-isolate in Elbaf, and things like trade was not possible. So they started taking what they needed. Honestly, I wish that I had the time to break down the full European history and development of distinct Viking culture, because I think Oda's been heavily inspired by a lot of this. But getting into the details of it in a succinct manner is tricky. Like, Viking culture is specifically dated to around 800 AD. And before then, this culture was called pre-Viking Scandinavians. But pre-Viking Scandinavians are essentially northern Germanic tribes, and we've talked about Germanic tribes in prior theory videos. Essentially, Germanic tribes sacked Rome multiple times, Rome being a great equivalent to something like the world government. It's also kind of the precursor of Vikings. They have a shared heritage and culture. So Germanic tribes, which were a huge thorn in Rome's side, became pre-Viking Scandinavians, became Vikings. It's not exactly pirates, but as an example, the word barbarian comes from the Latin barbarus, or Greek barbaros, which refers to people outside of the Greco-Roman world. So anybody who wasn't Roman was a barbarian. And the poster child for all of this is many of the Germanic tribes, who, by the way, was not one group, but many smaller groups. You can think of them like independent pirate crews, constantly at odds with each other as much as they were at odds with Rome. Sometimes they were allies with Rome, sometimes not. It's, that kind of relationship. I just feel like this is something that is worth knowing. The Vikings of today in the world of One Piece are the giants of Elbaf. But there's a long history of interacting with the quote-unquote civilized world. If you really want to simplify the One Piece story, it seems a lot about great empires forming and then breaking, and then attempting to reform, all the while in regular conflict with the free peoples, those not of the empire or barbarians. Anyway, Elder Jarl talked about rumors, a story that he heard about a frozen army of giants somewhere. We have almost definitely seen these frozen giants already in Punk Hazard. This is almost definitely the Warhammer company, essentially confirmed to have been captured by the world government, frozen now for probably hundreds of years. I just hope that Oda does something spicy with this. Like go back to Punk Hazard when Chopper and group ran into this hallway of frozen giants. It was kind of out of place and unexplained, and it carries so much potential to go somewhere. Like, I feel like there's a reason why, as we're discussing what's happening in this chapter with the Warhammer company, like Oda has big plans for this group. They have some role to play. Oda has been laying clues for far too long for it to come to nothing, in my opinion. So the first thought that comes to mind is, these giants are frozen. Why can't you just unfreeze them, and would they still be alive? My strong guess is yes. We got some pseudoscience in One Piece regarding cryogenics. And this naturally leads into a follow-up speculation. If the giants are frozen and can potentially be unfrozen and still alive, did the world government do this on purpose? And based on where they're being kept, in Punk Hazard, a research facility, yada yada, my strong guess would be yes. The world government intentionally froze them so that at some point in the future they could unfreeze them and potentially utilize their knowledge and abilities. As a side note, this highly reminds me of the frozen straw hat hidden beneath Mary Joie. We just saw the straw hat, so unfreezing the straw hat doesn't seem that important to me, but what else is being kept there? Is Imu essentially doing the same thing with the giants that he's doing below Mary Joie? Is there, for instance, a corpse of somebody that could be from the Void Century, yet come back to life in present day? Now, the problem with this theory is that I don't expect that the Warhammer company would in any way be loyal to Imu intentionally. So what exactly would be the point of freezing them in time and then eventually thawing them out? Well, now we know Imu can flip people and essentially become their ruler. Something like this works well with an idea that Imu intends to use this company to create something for him in the future. Also, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Be on the lookout for Darth Joyboy to appear. I'm just saying. This also reminds me somewhat of Ors, who was also kept frozen, eventually made to be a slave by the Shadow Master Gecko Moria. I'm not going to spell out specifically what I'm thinking, but I hope that you guys can roughly understand. But to go back to the Warhammer company, right? One thing that I think is a Chekhov's gun that has to happen at some point in time is they passed down the blueprints to create the counter Pluton in the case that the Pluton fell into the wrong hands. I think that these blueprints have to be utilized. And my theory for a decade or more now is that either Frankie didn't actually destroy the blueprints, he destroyed a false copy, and or just memorized them. So Frankie possesses the knowledge of how to create the counter Pluton. The world government or Blackbeard or whoever ends up finding the Pluton, Frankie then has a directive from ancestors in the past to create this counter Pluton, which I speculated would ultimately end up becoming upgrades to the Thousand Sunny. So the Thousand Sunny would become the counter Pluton. But now with some of what is going on in this chapter, I think you have a very realistic way of inverting all of this from everything that we speculated before. The Warhammer company is unfrozen and they're manipulated or coerced into creating the counter Pluton, which they have also memorized. The only thing that I would assume that they're lacking for such a blueprint is the Eternal Flame, something the world government now has, or at least partially has, because of York and Vegapunk's Mother Flame. So Imu may possess the things that they need in order to recreate the counter Pluton or the Pluton, which means the Straw Hats would need to create the counter Pluton, steal the counter Pluton, or find the Pluton instead. Either way, I feel like the narrative with the Pluton is going to become very relevant soon. We know that its actual location is in Wano, so this conversation has value. I think that shortly after this arc, all of this is going to start happening, whatever the specific details might be. But yeah, let's flip pages back to the beginning of this chapter, because as much as it focused on Harold, it also focused on Loki. Honestly, Loki's story is heartbreaking to me. To imagine being a child, a baby, that nobody loved. And I had some thoughts before that maybe Loki was loved, at least some degree, by, for instance, Harold or Ida, Hyruden's mother, because Ida is just a genuine being. But Loki really got none of that. It's actually crazy how consistent Oda is with this in the story, but it's just really common that if you are a character that has big dreams and aspirations and ambitions in the world of One Piece, most likely you're neglecting your children. There are very, very few Father of the Year candidates in the story of One Piece. But I love how nuanced Oda makes it. It's not like these fathers don't love their children, hate them, or intend for them to suffer. It's just it's hard to balance changing the world and being there for your children. So you have some examples like Luffy, who doesn't care, and you have other examples like Usopp, where I think Usopp does care, but he just understands. He doesn't seem to blame his father for being absent. His father is his idol, is his hero who he kind of wants to be. So in both Luffy and Usopp's case, and many others, I don't think that they required their father to be there. It in no way hindered their development as people. So all of this is context to why I think that the Loki story has so much value. Loki, in fact, needed his father to be there. And Harold obviously was too consumed by other things to realize this. You know, I think if you really dig down deep into it, it has a lot to do with Loki's mother not loving him. I think Oda has been on record saying that mothers are the antithesis of adventure. Whether you agree with Oda about this or not, it appears as if he's kind of has a worldview related to traditional gender roles. The mother as the nurturer. And in most cases in the story, the mother usually dies, which allows the hero to begin the adventure. Basically, nobody wants to worry their mother, who cares about their safety deeply, and would be concerned if they did dangerous things. Usopp's mother died, Nami's mother died. I think that it's very likely in the coming chapters we will find out that Harridan's mother, Ida, died. Sanji's mother, Sora, Nico, Olvia, it happens a lot. It feels kind of weird to say, but some of the subtext here is that in order for someone to be free to go do great things, likely their mother has to die in the process. But it's obviously very important for a child to be loved. And in a lot of the cases, in the Strat crew and elsewhere, they don't have parents, period. Zoro, Luffy, sort of, Chopper and Frankie. And in many of these cases, they adopt kind of a surrogate mother who will love them, or a surrogate family. This is why Dadan will always be Luffy's mother. Zoro and Koshiro and Kuena, Sanji, eventually with Zeph and the Baratie, some sort of stable household, Being loved as a child is crucial. And honestly, I think the Sanji example could be the most interesting out of all of this, because Zeph played a maternal role in Sanji's life. Zeph quite literally gave flesh and blood for Sanji to be able to grow and survive. Because of this, Sanji felt indebted to Zeph and essentially required his permission to begin the adventure. In my opinion, this is how Oda sees a mother's role in a child's life. A mother sacrifices greatly so that a child may live. So a child may view it as unappreciative if they throw their life away, pursuing improbable and likely dangerous dreams. So it feels like Oda intentionally crafted Loki's backstory so that he would have none of this. His actual mother didn't love him, his father was absent, and because of his mother and her prophecies, everyone else didn't love him either. He was essentially raised eventually by his mother's brother, who also despised him. It was almost like borderline a Cinderella story. But anyway, we were really quick to say this, but now that we've gotten the vast majority of Loki's backstory, it is safe to say that if you had to circle one character whose backstory is most similar, that character would be Robin. Robin's mother and her father were not really in her life. And just like King Harold, it doesn't matter that Nico Olvia loved Robin, because she simply wasn't there to show it. Meanwhile, Robin was raised in Ohara, where everybody who lived there viewed her as a demon child, as a monster, because of her devil fruit. She wasn't really accepted or loved. But I would say that Loki's story seems to be a more extreme version of Robin's, because eventually Robin had a talent as an intellect, as a scholar, right? She got accepted as a member of the Scholars of Ohara. She found some companionship there, but really that was short-lived. And not long after all of this, the entire island of Ohara was destroyed, and the world at large referred to Robin as a demon child. She was hunted by the world government, she was betrayed at every turn, and once again, nobody loved Robin, and she kind of let her darker side take over, very similar to Loki, just in order to survive. But I just want to make sure that this is clear. Oda's parallels between Robin and Loki are very much intentional. There is absolutely a reason that we essentially began this arc with a reunion between Robin and Jaguar D. Saul. He intended for us to make these comparisons. So I said this when it happened, but I want to reiterate it now. It's just absolutely masterful storytelling that we felt like we understood Robin's backstory in Water 7 in Enies Lobby. But we get here to Elbaf and you realize that there was even more that Oda could add to the story to make us really appreciate what made Robin. And in chapter 1133, we find out that, Robin, it was a struggle for her to survive. And there were many times where she considered unaliving herself. Basically, the moral to this story is Jaguar D. Sol saved her life because he promised her that one day she would find friends. And I think that that's pretty much all Robin has ever wanted. Not to undermine her big dream, fulfilling the will of O'Hara and so. But like what Robin really wants is just to have friends. Something she struggled to obtain from the very moment that she was born. Robin chose to believe in Sol's promise, and without that, her skeleton would be scattered across the rocks in some random island. So obviously in this chapter, Oda went all the way with these parallels because Loki wanted so badly for people to love him and to give him attention. He sought attention in all sorts of different ways. And at the end, he just came to the realization of how alone he was. Lashing out in anger did not fulfill him. It only made him further realize how isolated he was. A lot of people are semi-clowning this online, right? But Loki borrowed Kaido's feat of falling from the Sky Islands to the ground below and not dying. But he had every intention to die. Living alone without love and without friends is simply not a life worth living. But I think within this, I discovered one thing that I got wrong. When I talked about this before, I talked about how Robin had a Sol in her life that allowed her to carry on, but Loki didn't necessarily have the same thing. Now my opinion is kind of different. I honestly think that Rox D. Zebec played a Jaguar D. Sol role in Loki's life. You can timestamp this right now. We can come back to it and see if I was right or wrong, but I feel pretty confident about this. In the next chapter, we're going to get some interaction between Loki and Rox D. Zebec, and I have a very strong feeling that the conversation is eventually going to include Joy Boy, or Niga. I have a feeling that Zebec will inspire Loki to become Joy Boy, and in some form or fashion communicate to Loki that Joy Boy is a guy who's one day going to have a lot of friends. In my opinion, this will be the parallel to Robin and Sol. Loki essentially needs some kind of hope or promise for a better future, and Zebec will provide that. And then, just the same as Robin and Sol, they go separate ways, and Rox D. Zebec is supposedly killed. But yeah, I do feel like what I just said is at least a little bit wrong. I think part of this as well is Loki just felt like he could be friends with the Rocks Pirates, that their ideals aligned with him, and so he'd found his friends in the Rocks Pirates, but we already know that he was too young to travel with Zebec at the time. But this would all work to accomplish essentially the same thing. Call it proof of concept, right? Like Loki learns here that having friends is a possibility in the future. So Zebec gave him a reason to live. And we may also need a reason to live after he learns that Zebec has been killed, which may be becoming Joy Boy. Also, I feel like I brought up Laboon at some point recently for some reason. Well, why did I bring up Laboon? I can't exactly remember. Anyway, it is very likely that Loki has a Laboon-like moment with the Zebec pirates. Essentially a promise that Zebec would eventually return or that he might be able to join the crew. But yeah, I suppose while we're here, kind of the elephant in the room that we didn't discuss is, yes, we had an interaction between Loki and Zebec in this chapter. But more than that, we got an official face reveal for Rox D. Zebec, and he looks almost exactly like Blackbeard. Also, it literally says that Blackbeard is Zebec's son. Good golly, man. I guess my first question is why here and why now? I feel like we say this every 5 or so chapters, but it really feels like we're in the end game. Like it is time for the snowball to roll down the hill. Oda is not holding back. It is time for us to know some things. But yeah, the implications of all of this, the conclusions that you could draw from it, the discussion there within is all a bit overwhelming. I'm pretty sure I was one of the first people who made an official theory video speculating a relationship between Rox D. Zebec and Blackbeard. But I never actually speculated that Blackbeard was Rox D. Zebec's son. If I'm honest, my headcanon was trapped in the universe where Dragon was Rox D. Zebec's son. That's just kind of what I liked, and it never had a reason to change. Once again, Oda delivers. If my theory is wrong because Oda has cooked up something just as or even cooler, I'm for that. This certainly fits the description. But anyway, the kind of obvious smoking gun that there was some kind of relationship between Roxy Zebec and Blackbeard is Blackbeard's ship is called the Saber of Zebec. And Blackbeard was 2 years old when Zebec died, so for Zebec to be this influential figure while also being erased from history, it's like, there's gotta be something more here. Zebec being the dad absolutely fits. Suddenly it's all starting to make sense. Again, I say this all the time, right? But Oda parallels everything all the time, and we talk about these parallels all the time, but the moment that we learned that Blackbeard is Rox D. Zebec's son, but Blackbeard goes by Marshall D. Teach, and not Rox D. Teach, the immediate thought is Ace, right? Ace used his mother's maiden name for reasons, but as a foil or an invert here, Ace didn't appreciate that Goldie Roger was his father, didn't consider Goldie Roger to be his father, whereas Blackbeard doesn't seem to have the same philosophy. More likely than not, Blackbeard hid his true last name because that name was a danger to him. Or maybe he simply does not know. I don't consider that to be likely, but it is possible. But yeah, I didn't spend 10 minutes of this review talking about family and being loved for no reason, right? Because all of this conversation, I think, is very relevant if you want to potentially try to understand Blackbeard. Look at Blackbeard as a child and the expression on his face, it's gotta remind you of child Loki. Just seems like a guy who doesn't believe in love. So I want us to use our imagination to hypothetically compare Blackbeard's fictitious backstory with Loki and Robin. Raised by genetic, loving mother and father? No. Considered to be a monster or a freak for reasons that potentially he can't control? Yes. Loki was born with weird eyes, Robin had her devil fruit, and Blackbeard has a strange body, which apparently prevents him from sleeping. Look man, I know that Whitebeard wanted nothing more than to be a father to all of his children, and the Whitebeard pirates are good people and they wanted to embrace everybody. But if you have a guy on your crew who literally does not sleep, I think it's just natural to be a little bit freaked out about that, to be a little bit creeped out. And if you are that person that is a freak by nature, you would feel isolated, regardless of everyone else's intentions. As everyone else falls asleep and you literally cannot, feel like that would be a very isolating feeling. You'd feel very alone. And I also think that there could be further parallels between Blackbeard and Ace. Just simply being Rox's child puts a target on your back. If people were to discover this, you would make enemies without even trying. But there's also this element of Whitebeard himself. It is so cool to me that you have this potential parallel between Whitebeard and Garp, right? Garp raised his enemy's son, Ace, while secretly Whitebeard did the same thing with Blackbeard. Looking at him, I think that he had to have known that Blackbeard was Zebec's son, and his goal was most likely to love him as best as he could. But the problem is how much can Whitebeard really love Blackbeard? Whitebeard was a member of Zebec's crew, and we can gather through context clues and some explicit information, ultimately Whitebeard isn't the biggest fan of Zebec. Not in the same way that he seems favorable to and seems to believe in Roger. So all this becomes really poignant when eventually Ace joins the Whitebeard pirates. Whether Whitebeard intended this or not, between Blackbeard and Ace, who do you think that Whitebeard loved more, or believed in more? Very obviously Ace. And some of this subtext is very overt in Marineford because of Squardo, right? It just seems like many of the Whitebeard pirates understood at some fundamental level that Whitebeard had a preference for Ace, and all of this relates to Whitebeard's conversation with Roger, where Roger likely told Whitebeard that somebody someday would save the world, and that this person would be a D, and that he thought it would be his son. And I think that Whitebeard believed that his son would one day save the world. And even if it took Whitebeard until Blackbeard betrayed him to admit it, right? Blackbeard is not the guy that Roger is waiting for, and therefore wasn't the guy that it appears as though Whitebeard was waiting for. Personally, I think that Whitebeard suspected or knew this for a while. So again, unintentional or not, Whitebeard was preparing Ace to become king, and it could be perceived as preferential treatment among his children. I think probably nobody felt this more than Blackbeard, who was the son of Rox D. Zebec. I gotta say guys, I just have a feeling that Blackbeard's story really began when Ace joined the Whitebeard Pirates. I think something about that really triggered him. The moment that Thatch acquired the Yami Yami no Mi, Blackbeard was prepared to do what was required, even betraying his family, because he didn't feel loved, not in the same way. And in my opinion, it is certainly not a coincidence that Blackbeard has sort of created a new family with the Blackbeard Pirates, comprised of people that the world has rejected, freaks of a similar level as him, people that just cannot be loved. But yeah, I don't want to get too specific, but this theme of love, especially as a child, I think is going to be very relevant to Blackbeard's entire story. His story has all the makings of being similar to Loki's and Robin's. But yeah, while we're here, now that we know that Blackbeard is Roxy Zebec's son, there's a million other things that suddenly you can conclude. Blackbeard attacking Shanks in the past. Bro, just look at Blackbeard's face when the Whitebeard Pirates encountered the Roger Pirates in Odin's flashback. He seems especially ticked off. And this contrasts with Blackbeard's general demeanor, how he wanted to portray and present himself. Unassuming, unimportant, innocently jovial. He displayed none of that in Odin's flashback. And then you realize, well, if Blackbeard knew that he was Zebec's son, the guy who defeated Zebec was Roger. It could have been much more personal to him, and taking on a guy like Shanks when they were both relatively young could be something like revenge. It may also be somewhat significant that Blackbeard chose Whitebeard's crew, given Whitebeard was a former member of Zebec's crew. Maybe Blackbeard thought that the Whitebeard Pirates would accept him because of who he was. But if he was hoping for that, I very much doubt that he got that. But yeah, obviously at this point, we're making a lot of assumptions. Things like, did Blackbeard intentionally choose Whitebeard's crew, or did Whitebeard happen to find him? We don't know anything. But if ever there was a time for just going off, I feel like it's now. Another thing that I'm thinking about, and it kind of horrifies me, but I'm thinking about Garp. We know that Garp was recently captured by Blackbeard. Garp is the other guy, along with Roger, who defeated Roxy Zebec. Again, it's possible for Blackbeard. This is very personal. But anyway, another thing I think that everyone is probably thinking about right now is we know that Blackbeard has a weird body, and we're not entirely sure why, although speculation and theories have existed for decades now. But a question that I have now that the thought of Blackbeard having parents at all has entered my brain is Roxy Zebec the same? Is this weird body genetic? Now, a theory that has gone around the community that I've seen is there's some visual similarities between a guy like Kuma and Blackbeard. They have the same sort of deep black curly hair. Their body types are similar, so people wonder if Blackbeard is a buccaneer. Something that I think is, all things considered, not that crazy. But even if this is true, I don't think that this explains Blackbeard's weirdness. Kuma, we know, sleeps. Luffy and Zoro didn't react to Kuma in the same way that they reacted to Blackbeard. So if he's not a buccaneer, or being a buccaneer has nothing to do with this, then maybe he's got some other kind of blood in him, some other unique race that we haven't heard of. We've gotten all sorts of new ones in the post-timeskip Three-Eyed Tribe and such. It's possible. It just feels like a huge reach to me. So believe it or not, I try my hardest not to drown in my own headcanon, right? Your mind needs to be flexible when you get new information. Don't just hang on to old thoughts because they're comfortable, because you've had them for a long time. That being said, I still think that what's unique about Blackbeard is unique to Blackbeard and Blackbeard alone. Thoughts like Blackbeard was experimented on as a child by the world government. I still like that. So just bear with me, but this feels like a great opportunity for Oda to do some foiling. We know that after the world government executed Roger, they scoured the planet for his son, who they suspected existed, or at least they scoured the planet for a potential son they didn't even know existed. Do you think they did the same with Roxy Zebec? My strong guess, my strong feeling is yes. So think about how improbable it was that the world government never found Ace. Firstly, Portgas D. Rouge held Ace and prevented him from being born. for almost, I think it was like an entire year or more. I'm not so certain that Blackbeard's mother did the same. And then after Ace was born and Portgos de Rouge died, he was taken by Garp. Again, a thing that is just so improbable. So I kind of like the thought that, at least early in his life, Ace got all the plot armor, and Blackbeard did not. But here's the real interesting thing, right? The world government made this big event with the execution of Ace, the son of Gold D. Roger. But their tactic with Rox was very different than how they approached Roger. They tried to erase Rox from history. So there would be no public announcement that they have found Rox de Zebec's son. All of it would be so much more quiet and secretive. But yeah, I guess I could just imagine very easily one of the Gorosei, such as Saturn, seeing this child and knowing it's Rox de Zebec's son and deciding, you know what, let's experiment on it. Just feels like something that they would do. But obviously, if you go down this rabbit hole, you then create a new question, which would be, how did Blackbeard get to the Whitebeard pirates? Couldn't tell you. We'd obviously need more. I'm just stuck on the fact that Blackbeard does not sleep, and I find it hard to believe that this is a genetic trait. But we'll obviously find out. But yeah, here we are, and we haven't actually talked much about Rox at all yet. I think the first thing that struck me is how different Rox seems to Blackbeard. And I wonder if some of this is intentional. Like if there was some kind of challenge and you could only use one word to describe Blackbeard, or maybe like 2 words to describe Blackbeard, I would say that it's a combination of ambitious but cautious. Up until this point in the story, there are very few moments where you would say that Blackbeard is being reckless. Whatever risks might be there are calculated, and for the most part, Blackbeard avoids no-win scenarios. And maybe I'm off base, but I do not get this impression about Rox. Man assassinated an admiral during the reverie. That was, as far as we are aware, his first move before he became a criminal. Like seriously, Blackbeard's first move after being a pirate for his entire life was to assassinate Thatch in the dead of night and then run away. Look, man, I might be overreacting. It's possible that Zebec has a careful nature like Blackbeard. I just straight up don't get that impression. He comes off to me as a figure that we would more easily compare to Luffy. He seems like he recklessly does things. That's the energy that I get from it. And this impression works seamlessly with what we've already gotten when the Rox pirates showed up to God Valley. Again, Zebec's energy there was very reminiscent of Luffy, with perhaps arrogance on full blast instead of just straight stupidity. Whitebeard in the background trying to rein him in. So once again, I'm not entirely sure how Blackbeard might know whatever it is that he knows, but if he's so distinctly different, is that on purpose? Like, Rox failed. Maybe Blackbeard heard some stories from Whitebeard about what his father was like and was like, you know what, let me learn from this. Because the interesting thing about Blackbeard is, despite his cautiousness, I don't really think that he's a coward. It just seems like he's trying to maximize the probability of success in a sort of rational way. So this philosophy might actually be based on something and have reason to justify it. He's clearly following in his father's footsteps. His ship is named the Saber of Zebec. I kind of think that Blackbeard thought that his father could have done it if he hadn't been so reckless. But yeah, I gotta say, I immediately like Zebec as a character. Something about him just seems different from all of the other characters that we've had. Maybe it most reminds me of Bellamy, but in a world where Bellamy isn't a scrub and knows that nobody is better than him. Like as if Bellamy's energy to Luffy is a character's energy to literally everything and everyone. And even with a guy like Kaido, who is the world's strongest creature and can't be killed, yada yada, there's like a somber undertone there of a man who's kind of already partly defeated for reasons we may not understand. I get none of that from Zebec here. Like, it really does feel like he's about to kick the world's ass and isn't totally delusional about it. Maybe my words are failing me, but regardless, I like it. The dick version of Luffy. But yeah, I suppose there's plenty of other random things that we could speculate. I've heard mentioned that people wonder whether or not he possesses the Opi Opi no Mi because of the way that he's holding his fingers. It seems possible to me. It also seems like kind of a reach. But based on this chapter itself, I feel like one question you should ask is, what is Zebec's interest in heralds? I mean, at this point, we get the narrator box, right? The Rocks pirates aren't even technically formed yet. We had the Reverie recently, which Harold escaped because Zebec assassinated somebody, and apparently Harold saw Zebec there, and then now Zebec is in Elbaf looking for Harold. This seems like a can of worms by itself. Based on his crew at the moment, Shiki, Whitebeard, Big Mom, I think an intuitive thought is that Zebec has come here to recruit Harold and potentially the Giants to his cause. That isn't too outlandish. This would also be another great parallel, because at the beginning of Elbaf itself in present day, the world government and the God's Knights showed up to recruit Loki and effectively do the same thing, and attempted that before with Harold. But the coincidence of this, given that we know that Emu believes having the Giants on his side is important, it makes me wonder whether Zebec already knows things about the true history and the prophecies of Nika. I guess I'm really curious to figure out exactly Zebec's story. Look, I talked a big game about Zebec being clearly different from Blackbeard, right? And Zebec not being like Blackbeard in terms of the weirdness of his body, or not sleeping, right? But maybe some of these things actually explain Zebec better. Man literally woke up one day and chose violence. Never has this expression been more accurate. So why then? Why suddenly? Did he just crash the Reverie in a similar way as Dragon declaring war on the world government, or was he a king? Could something have happened to his country? Stranger things have indeed happened. The world government is pretty notorious for screwing around with all the various countries. At this point, all we got is shit to throw against the wall. So if you ask me what my official opinion is, my answer is I have no idea, but I'm hyped. That is my official opinion. But yeah, I think that this is everything that I had to say today. I think I got everything. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think, whether you know something from the chapter that I might have missed. Just share your thoughts. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.